CSLA, or the 21 CSLA, is dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders, teachers, site, and district leaders to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Headquartered at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Education, it is led in partnership with UCLA School of Education and the California Subject Matter Projects, and also the 7 regional academies across the state. 21 CSLA is sponsored by the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, the California Department of Education, and the State Board of Education. We are led by our equity statement that leaders for equity transform education to improve access, opportunity, and inclusion for students and adults, especially those who are systemically marginalized and historically underserved, so that they can thrive. In connection with our equity statement, this 21 CSLA headquarters is located at UC Berkeley. And we encourage everyone to join us and to join UC Berkeley in a land acknowledgement. UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo speaking Ohlone people, and the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, along with other Verona Band descendants. Every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of our land. Consistent with the values of our UC Berkeley community, inclusion and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As that, we invite you to join us in recognizing the Shumi land tax, a voluntary financial contribution to that non-Indigenous people living on traditional Chochenyo and Ohlone territory make to support the critical work of the land trust. If you have benefited from this land, we encourage you to give. Today's webinar is focusing on an important issue in our equity agenda, which is our combined equity agenda, which is about diversifying the educator workforce. We will start with a presentation, a research presentation from our featured researcher, Dr. Travis Bristol. And then we will hear from a group of esteemed panelists across the state of California who have been working on a report for the State Superintendent of Instruction around improving educator diversity. Then there will be an opportunity for question and answer from our participants. So we encourage you to place your questions in the chat throughout the researcher presentation as well as the panelist presentations. We will be monitoring the chat and then using your questions from the chat to inform our Q&A portion of our agenda, followed by closing comments from our researcher. Well, let's begin without further ado. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and a faculty member, Dr. Travis Bristol, who is an assistant professor at the University of California at Berkeley's Graduate School of Education. He's a former student and teacher in New York City public schools and teacher educator in the Boston residency program. Dr. Bristol's research is situated at the intersections of educational policy and teacher education. Using qualitative methods, he explores 3 related research strands: the role of educational policies in shaping teacher workplace experiences and retention, district and school-based professional learning, and the role of race and gender in educational settings. While we don't have enough time in this webinar for me to review all of the accolades that Dr. Bristol has received, there are a few recent awards that I would like to note. In this year, 2021, Dr. Bristol received the Early Career Award from the American Educational Research Association. And as you will hear in a few minutes, he began his role as chair of Superintendent Thurman's advisory group on educator diversity. Finally, in the past few weeks, he was elected chairman of the board of directors for the National Board for the Teaching Profession. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Dr. Travis Bristol.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just share my screen here. All right, can folks see my screen? All right, so first, thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction, and thank you and your colleagues for the transformative work that you're doing here to raise the capacity of leadership across one of the world's largest economies. Today, I'm going to speak a bit about, and very briefly, building and sustaining an ethnically racially diverse educator workforce. And to that point about the world's largest economy, if you hear me say anything today, I want you to leave here recognizing and understanding that the challenges we face are not one about resources, because California is not one of the largest economies in the United States, but it is one of the largest economies in the world. And so it's really a question not about resources, it's a question about will. And time again, this country has demonstrated that when it wants to do something, when it has the will to tackle a challenging and a pressing problem, it will invest the resources it needs to do so. So, quick history lesson, 1957, when the Soviets launched a satellite into space called Sputnik, and the US feared that it was losing its prominence in the world. Well, what did we do? About roughly 12 years later, we sent a person to the moon. And so, we put our resources and will to tackling this problem. Because we've moved out of the post-truth era and reject the idea that space may be the final frontier, but it's made in a Hollywood basement, we can hold true to that. Indeed, when this country has prioritized an issue, it will invest the resources. I think for all of us, when we think about the fact that we are teaching in mass and that this that COVID is still very much present, what we see is that if you look at the timeline for vaccine innovation, you see that when this country wanted to begin to preserve, I would say, white life, we put our resources. If this was another talk, we could talk about that spread between Ebola and COVID and the COVID-19 vaccine. But I just want to underscore yet again this idea that the challenges we face around diversifying the educator workforce, it's not about resource, it is about will. And the question that we have to ask ourselves time and time again is there a will? And I would say that we should focus on educator diversity because of the rich body of evidence that we have, that indeed for Latinx students and for Black students, that when they have a Black or Latinx teacher, that there are some improvements to both their academic outcomes and social and emotional growth and development. And so I've documented some of this in a recent piece called "The Added Value of Latinx, Value of Black and Latinx Teachers for the Black and Latinx Students," and I've shared, and in this piece, I've shared both qualitative and quantitative research. I'll leave this here that again underscore the importance of Latinx teachers for their Latinx students. And that piece also highlights the clear body of evidence for why Black teachers, right, matter for their Black students. In the coming weeks, I suspect you'll be hearing about this new study that my colleague here at UC Berkeley, Tawny Britton, and another colleague, Matt Sherrill, a study that we've looked at 10 years of data from New York City public schools. This is a working paper, so I'm just sharing it here first. And you should be hearing, like I said, in a couple of weeks, it'll sort of come out. But what we found is, in addition to this added value for Black students and for Latinx students, this study here also highlights the added value for Asian and Asian American students when they have an Asian or Asian American teacher. And what we found was that, similar to Black students and similar to Latinx students, that when Asian students and Asian American students have an Asian or Asian American teacher, that we see some causal links between their likelihood of being suspended, which is to say that suspension decreases. And so, given this added value for Black teachers and for Latinx teachers and for Asian American teachers, we are left with the fact that there is this demographic mismatch across the United States, such that we have a workforce that does not represent the ethno-racial diversity of students. Now, these data you've heard before and you've seen before, but what I want to underscore here is that there is evidence, there is science to demonstrate that there is this added value, and we have this demographic mismatch. Now, of course, these data around these national numbers are different based on the state, and we see variations across states. But it is true that across states like California, like Tennessee, for example, that some of the greatest demographic mismatch that we see between teachers and students is between Latinx teachers and Latinx students. And so you will often hear me say, and my colleagues who are working with me on the state superintendent's teacher advisory group, that when we say teacher diversity, that we have to underscore the importance of particularly Latinx teachers, because that is where we see some of the greatest mismatch. So how do we begin to address this issue of supporting and having more teachers of color in the workforce? And I would say that one way to begin or to patch this leaky pipe is to first acknowledge and start with what happens in schools for children of color. I'm borrowing this chart. One of my doctoral students, Akeem Ballard, created this for our class this week, and I've shared it. But what you'll see here on the left, in the left bar, is that, for example, you'll see that Black students make up about 18% of preschool students across the United States. And yet they account for 43% of suspensions. When I shared this with the students, I'm teaching our PLI students in the Principal Leadership Institute. One of the things that students said was that they didn't even know that preschool suspension was a thing. They didn't know that we suspended preschoolers in this country. And because I believe it's so important to lead with one story, when I picked up my son many years ago in New York City from preschool and was called into the director's office, and she said to me, "We're asking your son to take a 2-week break." It was at that moment that I learned that preschool suspension was a thing. I had never heard about it, but I had experienced it with my own son. And in conversations with many other particularly Black faculty members, we've all talked about that our sons have had this particular experience. And so I highlight this idea that at the very moment that particularly Black students are entering school, they're more likely to leave school. And this happens, again, even here in the state of California, throughout the K-12 pipeline. And so we can't begin to encourage or get more, in this case, Black teachers into the profession if we disproportionately push them out before they can even access college, before they can even consider a career in teaching. And so we have to think about disciplinary issues that happen in K-12 schools. We also need to subsidize and to invest in teaching credentialing programs. And so here at UC Berkeley, we have this strong, the beginning of what will be, I believe, an incredible partnership with our district to fund aspiring teachers of color to become teachers. And it's important to note that many of these efforts, like True, are paying off. In these data, we see that we're starting to see an increase in teachers of color enter the profession. These recruitment efforts are paying off. And so what is important as we get more teachers into the profession is to begin to think about an infrastructure that for teachers, an infrastructure that can support and retain teachers of color. And I document this, and I'm in resources we can share more, where I try to imagine, right, what a teacher infrastructure, how that might look, from supporting teachers in clinically rich programs, through induction, through national boards, through becoming a national board certified teacher, that becomes part of this infrastructure that can both support and can retain teachers of color. And lastly, as we think about what it might mean to build and support an ethno-racially diverse workforce, yes, we need to think about what happens in K-12 schools, that we suspend a disproportionate number of children of color. Yes, we need to invest in schools and invest in preparation programs so that aspiring teachers of color who, because of historic racism, don't have access to the same sort of wealth and are making decisions not to attend high-priced programs like UC Berkeley. We also have to contend with the fact that teachers of color are also turning over at a higher rate. And so part of this infrastructure is also attending to issues around turnover. So these data come from the School and Staffing Survey, National Representative Survey of Teachers. And what we find is that teachers of color are turning over at a higher rate than their peers. In the state of California, we have, this comes from the Education Trust, there isn't a data dashboard to actually track turnover, disaggregated by teachers' racial ethno identity. So we have these national data, but we don't have state data, and that might be helpful as we think about building this infrastructure. And there are states like the state of Delaware who might track this. And finally, I'll just end with this, that indeed part of, I believe, this infrastructure that focuses on turnover specifically should focus on improving the working conditions, and in particular, weak administrative leadership. So in this study here, I document that teachers of color, Black male teachers in particular, said that they were leaving their schools, not because of their students, but they were leaving their schools because of their leaders. And in this, and here in this quote, this one teacher talked about why he decided to leave his school. He says, right now, right now, I don't think anybody really wants to be coming to the school, myself in particular, because of the lack of appreciation of the work and the principal coming in and looking at you only to find fault. In observations, you have two things in mind: what is happening that is good, what is happening that needs correction. So you present them in the same report, but then you come to just write one side of the whole story, and it's negative, it's demoralizing. And I don't believe that you run a school blaming teachers. And so what this teacher is saying is that one of the reasons why he chose to leave his school is because he had an administrator who potentially did not have the capacity to improve instruction and was only sort of focused on the negative. And so that means that as we are thinking about supporting teachers, around retaining teachers, we also have to think about how we grow the capacity of leaders to create the conditions to support teachers. And so I'll just end here, that as we think about building and sustaining an ethno-racially diverse educator workforce, we have to patch the teachers of color pipeline. And that means first looking at K-12 disciplinary, or PK-12, as I think about my own son, PK-12 disciplinary policies. We have to think about a teacher infrastructure that supports accomplished teaching. And finally, we need to think about teacher turnover, and in particular, raising the capacity of leaders to create the conditions to support high quality and accomplished teaching. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. We're now going to introduce our guest panelists who have been working on the advisory group, and they're going to share some highlights about the upcoming report. First, I would like to introduce Shelley Gupton. Shelley is a member of the Board of Directors for the California Teachers Association, CTA, representing District E through June of 2023. She's a long-term educator and leader at the state level. She's previously served on multiple CTA bodies, including the Diversity Advisory Panel for 3 years. Second, I would like to introduce Soo-Hyun Han Harris, who is the coordinator with the Retention and Employee Development Team of the Talent Division at the Oakland Unified School District. She develops and supports district-wide programs and structures that enhance teacher pathways and retention in Oakland Unified School District. Our third panelist is Sarah Lillis, who is the Executive Director of Teach Plus California. Teach Plus develops and empowers teacher leaders to take action to improve opportunities and outcomes for students. Sarah has worked in state education policy advocacy for more than a decade She previously oversaw educational programming for California legislatures and managed programs in music education in New York. And our final guest is Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson, CEO of Diversity in Leadership Institute. She began the work of mentoring and retaining diverse school leaders while serving in school leadership roles in California Charter Schools Association, and later spun off the Diversity and Leadership Institute. Dr. McGowan Robinson is a lifelong educator and began her career as a teacher in Chicago public schools and has served as high school English teacher and a literacy coach in Oakland Unified School District. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I say attempt because, as you all know, we have days when we have technology meltdowns, and I think I'm having one of those days, but hopefully you can still see my screen if I could get it adjusted here. How are we looking? Everybody can see the slides now? All right. So as has been previously mentioned, State Superintendent Thurmond created a teacher diversity advisory group. And I want to frame the panelist discussions with the charge of this group. Specifically, on the CDE website, it states that in a pluralistic and increasingly global society, a diverse educator workforce benefits all students and advances educational equity. Currently in California, 23% of the student population is white, not Hispanic, while 63% of the teacher population is white. The largest group of students is Latino students at 54%, and only 20% of teachers share that demographic. And so that was part of the background and the charge for why State Superintendent Thurmond created this group. So we'd like to thank him as well as Chief Deputy Superintendent Nicely. Our panelists are going to provide a preview of some of the advisory group highlights that will be presented in a report, internal report to the superintendent and the California Department of Education. Sarah, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. We're thrilled to share a little bit about what we found in our work as part of the advisory group. We had spent the last several months meeting with and learning from leaders from throughout the state who've been trying to tackle the issue of how do we bring in a more representative teaching workforce, both in terms of recruitment, support, and retention. And so we're going to share some of our findings from those conversations with leaders from county offices of education, school districts, administrator preparation programs, as well as teachers of color. And so I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about what we found in terms of themes from what's been working so far from some of our local leaders. So the first of the four themes that really emerged from our research was the importance of growing their own teaching force. We've been very fortunate that the state has recognized the importance of investing in our teacher pipeline over the last several years. And many of the county and district leaders that we spoke with talked about how they've used those state investments to really develop grow your own teacher programs. Many of these programs address the high school student pipeline, the paraprofessional pipeline, the substitute teacher pipeline, the after-school teacher pipeline, as well as a maestro's pipeline. So looking for where are the places where we can develop and grow our own teachers of color. The second theme that emerged was the importance of partnerships and learning communities. And this emerged, and these partnerships and the networks and the learning communities was an ongoing theme that took a few different forms in what we heard. In particular, county and district leaders talked a lot about the importance of their partnering with institutes of higher education. So this is a really intentional connection between district and county office leaders and IHEs to create explicit pathways into the profession, like the Integrated Teachers of Color Pathway, which is a scholarship program to recruit future teachers of color. They also shared how important it was for district and county leaders to partner with one another. One of the benefits of being a state like California is that we're a gigantic state with a lot of innovative thinkers, and I think there's a real opportunity to learn from one another and support one another in that work. So they partnered around different trainings or other shared opportunities and nurturing their own talent, as well as just thought partners and thinking through how we tackle this challenge. They also utilize partnerships with external partners like the National Equity Project, Unity, various statewide organizations, and thought leaders like Goldie Muhammad. One thing that emerged from our conversation with teachers of color, and this is very consistent with what Teach Plus has found in our research with teachers of color, is the importance for teachers of color to have a safe space to share and connect, affinity groups to connect and learn together. We have just released, and I'm happy to share it with folks, a national report with the Center for Black Educator Development. And this focus on affinity groups for teachers of color is an ongoing theme that we hear over and over, and several of the districts that we spoke with are looking at and the teachers are asking for. The third theme that we heard, and I think it's sort of an overarching theme, was the importance of really intentionally prioritizing teacher diversity in systems and plans. So district and county leaders shared that it's important for them to be able to signal the commitment to teacher diversity by articulating comprehensive approaches to not only recruiting teachers of color, but supporting and retaining a more diverse teaching force. And this includes changing their staffing and programming. So some of the examples on the recruitment side that we heard were about creating new positions focused on diversity, implementing strategies for intentional recruiting into the field, utilizing scholarships, more effectively tracking hiring and placement, as well as standardized HR practices to combat biases in hiring. And I know that Laura's going to dig a little bit more deeply into some of these strategies in a bit. But we also talked about what are some of the explicit and comprehensive strategies on the retention side. And there they talked about integrating these programs. So thinking about how do you integrate the HR staff, school leaders, and financial officers to think about when we do have teacher residencies, where are we placing those teachers, and having it be a much more integrated strategy, so that we're really focused not only on placing them, but retaining and supporting them in those locations. They talked about the establishment of explicit roles that are focused on responding to teacher needs and concerns. So we have things like a special teacher development team, or a response manager, or diversity and equity leads. And so articulating clear roles that are about responding to the needs of teachers, to focus on retention. And the last piece, I think, is something that I heard Dr. Brissell mentioning, really talking about explicit data. So gathering explicit data and conducting research to explore the drivers around teacher retention. And I think that was really important to many of the district and county leaders that we spoke to. The fourth lever, the fourth theme that we heard that was working and it's important to these local leaders was about the importance of targeted funding to initiate and to sustain the program. So many of the things that we talked about here were driven, these opportunities to innovate were driven by state and federal investment. So with new targeted funds, local leaders, school districts, and county offices were able to really explicitly invest in our teacher pipeline and teacher retention. And so they use things like the Local Solutions Grants Program, the Classified Employee Grants Program, and teacher residency grants to really prioritize teacher diversity and recruiting and retaining an ethno-racial diverse staff. So in many cases, the seed funding has allowed them to start this. There is a lot of concern about, Shelley will talk about barriers, but the importance of being able to sustain these programs with sustained funding. But there were a lot of bright spots and a lot of things to learn from throughout the state. And so we hope to share a little bit more of that in the report. But I'm going to pass it over to Shelley to talk about some of the barriers that we heard about from our focus groups.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me okay. Rebecca talked about technology and how it just kind of sometimes fails you. And so I had to switch to phone all of a sudden, had everything all set up and boom, I'm using my phone. So please excuse me and hopefully you can hear me okay. Kind of basically just kind of following up with Sarah and some of the themes that came out. If we're talking about growing our own teaching force, there was a lot of talk with district and with county and with the educators that, you know, yes, these things are happening. We are seeing some of the programs. However, they're not widespread. They're not the norm. And so the question came up is, you know, when talking about growing your own programs, when are these things going to become the norm? How will we know that how does everyone know that these things are happening and that these programs are there and available for them? In the teacher convening, they talked about with the Grow Your Own programs that financial assistance should be a part of that, because you have paraeducators, sometimes with tuition or with housing, that if the funding is not there for them, then they don't continue. And so you have teachers of color who start something and then say, well, I can't continue this, I can't afford to continue doing something like this. So how do we ensure that when we have Grow Your programs, that we can keep people in those programs so that they become the educators that we need in the classroom for our students of color? In the building partnerships and building and learning communities, again, the expansion and making things the norm, the expansion of those partnerships. And they also, one of the groups, and I believe it was the county group, talked about the linking of community colleges. Sometimes with the partnerships of higher education, they're not always a part of that conversation. And how can they not be a part of that conversation, especially when we're talking about dual enrollment programs? So being able to expand so that we can make sure that that arm of community college and the programs that they have, that they could be a part of that, and that dual enrollment does flourish and becomes more widespread. Again, something that's the norm and not just, oh, it's happening here, but it's not happening there. And the other section that they talked about with the partnerships, I do remember in high school, in teaching, that high school students, there actually was an education component as part of CTE. Shocker. And that just kind of disappeared. And so how do we bring something like that back so that we can find those aspiring educators and we can grow them from high school all the way into college and into their teaching credential? And then intentionally prioritizing teacher diversity in systems, as Sarah talked about. Having those, we have so many different districts and county offices that have developed wonderful equity programs, inclusiveness programs, and new positions. But again, like in other areas, that's not the norm. It needs to be more widespread. It needs to be something that's just, it's not something that a box that you check off. It's something that is going to happen. That that's in place. In the teacher convening, they talked about a lot about, Sarah talked about it, Dr. Bristol talked about it, they talked about teacher retention. And in the convening of the teachers, they talked a lot about that and that support. And the people that are going to be there, that are going to be able to say to them, hey, this is a profession you want to be a part of, and not necessarily running away and leaving the profession in 3 to 5 years, sometimes 2 to 5 years, but saying that this is a profession we want you to be in, and we want to help you grow into the educator that's going to support our students as well. So the theme, it's funding. Sarah kind of touched on it. I think that's the constant theme. Yes, we get shots in the arm. There was, like I said, there was a time when CTE did have an education section where people would come from high school and go into classrooms and actually work with students, and that kind of disappeared. So yes, we get one-time funding and it's a good shot in the arm. We get things going. And as many of the teachers mentioned, things just fizzle out. When do we have something that sustains? And when do we have something that stays with us and keeps growing and not just slowly but surely fade away? And so those are some of the things that came out in some of the meetings. And I'm going to pass it on to Sue Young to talk about the recommendations.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Hyun Han Harris. Thank you, Shelley. I am part of the recruitment and retention team in OUSD, and I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes a high-level overview of the recommendations that came out of our group's work together. And as you can imagine, you'll hear a lot of the things that were echoed by Sarah and Shelley in the recommendations. The overall thematic umbrella that we can think about is really the CDE is uniquely positioned really as an overarching educational umbrella to support with recruitment and retention of teachers of color, and really to move critical conversations forward and to broaden and institutionalize best practices across the state around recruitment and retention of teachers of color. So there are about 5 themes that came up that were identified that the CDE might support with. The first umbrella of recommendation is around creating communities of practice and fostering statewide dialogue around the critical importance of educator diversity. So the CDE really acting as a hub to collect and disseminate information about what counties and districts are doing statewide, and the resources that are available to support the work. There was a wide range of programming and varying levels of experience around recruitment and retention of teachers of color. And it was clear that much could be learned just through greater conversation and practice sharing across the state. And that's something that the CDE could help foster and facilitate. The second recommendation is also related to this idea that the CDE provide more explicit guidance for districts and counties around the use of grant and other funding through such things as providing models of recruitment and retention programs for teachers of color, including models for developing grow your own programs, how to embed affinity mentorship and group support for teachers and leaders, how to offset tuition costs and provide debt relief and offset housing costs, and so on. A key related recommendation under this umbrella is for the CDE to provide guidance to counties as they support districts through the iterative LCAP process, as they review and provide critical feedback to districts. A third theme of recommendation was, as Sarah and Shelley both mentioned, was maintaining sustainable base funding sources moving forward. So even with the massive investments currently heading towards districts right now, there was widespread acknowledgement that historically funding for diversity efforts have been ad hoc and really at the mercy of changing social political climates. So there was just wide acknowledgement that the low numbers of Black and brown teachers that we have is a result of historical and current systemic racism and exclusion, and it requires sustained funding over the long haul for us to begin to amend these disparities. The fourth area of recommendation was around promoting deeper partnerships and collaborations, which we've also heard. This was one that was also recognized as something that we all collectively take responsibility for as representatives of different institutions. But there was this acknowledgement that the more institutions can communicate and collaborate around teacher support, we can actually create a network of support for our teachers as they move from institution to institution along their pathway. So there's definitely a lot of room there for growth and greater collaboration. One specific recommendation worth mentioning under this category is that the CDE might work more intentionally with the CTC to incentivize partnerships among high schools, community colleges, and four-year universities to really think about the cradle to career trajectory for our teachers. And then finally, there was a recommendation that the CDE really provide widely disseminate information around legislative changes that are taking place that really have an impact on teacher diversity. Proposition 209, for example, was raised multiple times as a barrier as a barrier for districts to be able to explicitly name goals, intentions, and fundings earmarked to amend racial disparity. And also most recently, the other legislative piece, AB 130, that was passed in July, that allows coursework to be used to satisfy the basic skills and subject matter competency requirements, also having a significant impact on teachers' ability to move forward in the credentialing process. So there were other important recommendations that came up that I have not named today, but this is an ongoing conversation. So I'll pass the mic to Dr. McGowan Robinson.
Thank you, Sue. Potentially, I'll address some of those here in my remarks today. Today, I'll be sharing information from the council's work, specifically the contributions from school leaders of color and the role they play in the recruitment and retention of educators of color more broadly. During our conversations with educators, we heard directly from school leaders of color who gave testimonials about their own efforts and opportunities that they see when it comes to growing the pipeline of teachers and leaders of color and sustaining them. And Dr. Bristol so eloquently shared in his research presentation the role that good site leadership plays in the retention of educators. And so it's widely recognized that school leaders of color specifically play a role in the recruitment and retention of educators of color. Among the school leaders of color who contributed to the report, it was also cited that a good retention strategy is to provide greater opportunities for educators of color who seek educational leadership opportunities. Specifically, leaders of color spoke to the effectiveness and some of these things you've heard specifically, but I'll speak to it through the leader of color lens. But they spoke to effectiveness that they've seen in the Grow Your Own programs to support educators of color who are interested in leadership opportunities. There was a recognition that there's power in building pipelines for leaders of color from within. Not only do these educators know the communities as residents, but they know the students and families. Because of their proximity, their ongoing collaboration and commitment to the community, they can speak to the opportunities and the unique needs that exist within their organizations. And they also spoke to the effectiveness, as Sue pointed out, in building partnerships with institutions of higher education, professional affinity organization, as Sarah mentioned, and community partners to ensure that district and county diversity and leadership programs are responsive to racial diversity in their workforce. And specifically, as Sarah mentioned, school leaders of color also spoke about creating affinity spaces in districts or charter organizations and leadership development programs that address the needs of aspiring and current leaders of color. These leadership pipeline programs should specifically address bias, anti-Blackness, and the importance of leading with an equity lens. There was also a call to provide educators of color who are interested in school leadership, as we've talked about, and you've heard us kind of beating this point, with access to sustained funding to participate in these areas, specifically opportunities to grow professionally, as this is a barrier for aspiring leaders of color, and just access overall, especially looking at student debt that many of them may be already carrying as teachers wanting to pursue educational leadership opportunities. And there were some additional offerings specific to leaders of color, included not only a need for teachers to have social emotional support, but extending that support to leaders of color as well, to support their retention, as the retention of leaders of color is instrumental in the retention of educators of color more broadly. In addition, they cited a need for providing professional development or workshops to leaders more broadly on understanding bias and trauma and how it shows up within themselves and in students, and how leaders might better support educators of color around these issues. And finally, along the lines of recommendation for leadership was to promote anti-racist recruitment and retention best practices at all levels of employment, and to develop a data system, again, to understand and monitor the impact and efficacy of those practices. And there's a recognition that in order to address issues around recruitment and retention, we must look at systemic practices that may be contributing or are contributing to the lack of retention of educators of color and leaders of color.
Thank you so much to our panelists for your efforts in the substantial work that you've conducted in these in order to complete this set of advisory recommendations. As was mentioned in the chat, I just want to highlight that in addition to the internal report that this working group is developing, there will also be a public op-ed that highlights the major recommendations that can be used for the public. And so we're moving now to the question and answer portion of our agenda. We have one question so far in the chat that I think is a good place for us to start. This comes from Ben Fills, and the question is about peer-to-peer support. In it, because we know that, of course, supervisors and in our hierarchical system will be obligated to provide support. What examples of peer-to-peer support did you find to be effective in the retention or the recruitment of diverse teachers? Sarah, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I can start us off. Well, I think we did hear from the teachers themselves about the importance of creating space, whether it was affinity groups or targeted professional learning opportunities, teacher-led, teacher-driven professional learning opportunities. They were really looking at the specific needs as defined by the educators in the classroom. We heard I think about, and I'm happy, I'll put in the chat a report that we just recently released that was written by our Teach Plus policy fellows or educators in the classroom, looking at the need for also self-reflection. And so providing support and tools for educators by educators around your own needs and self-reflection, as well as how you're interacting with your students. I will just say, because the nature of this advisory group, a lot of our, we had a lot of conversations with administrators themselves, and we were asking, what can the State Department of Ed do to better support you and the work, which is, I think, probably why it feels like it's a very administrator focused recommendations, because I think that was where we, the folks that we were meeting with saw the levers for change and the role of the state. But I would defer to some of my colleagues if they have other things they want to add.
I was just going to add that there was a lot of talking in the teacher group about the feeling that they could have those conversations, that it was okay to have, affinity groups to have those meetings, and that goes back to what Dr. Laura was talking about with the with a safe space, and how she was talking about the site leadership and being able to just accept, hey, these teachers are going to just kind of meet. They're going to meet over in this classroom after school. It's after hours, and that being okay. And there was talk of, why can't we do this, and why do we get the feeling that we're not supposed to do this? And that was something that they did mention.
And I'll just add that when we think about peer-to-peer support, it wasn't only with teachers. So what has one actually outcome that this advisory group, I think, should take a great deal of credit for, is that right after our first meeting, so we met with various counties. The counties, the Office of Education, right, said, we want to keep on doing this. And so the CDE actually created a professional learning community. And I see, I think Terry, I saw Terry on here. So what the CDE is now doing is it created a professional learning community for county offices of education who want to continue education diversity, educative diversity work. And so peer-to-peer is also, I think, we should also think about it at the county level, as we also think about like teacher to teacher.
So as a follow-up to that question, I received another question, which is about building the capacity to support affinity work. Many of you described the great need for it, how there are a lot of current practices around this, and how both teachers and leaders attested to the benefits of those spaces. How do we build the spaces to build the capacity of our system to support them, to facilitate these types of spaces and offerings? And it's not just the county offices, as Dr. Brissa was just mentioning. This could be a leader at a school who wants to support their teachers, or it could be a district that wants to support their teachers and leaders. Does anyone have any suggestions about how we can systematically build capacity for facilitating supportive spaces for educators of color?
It's funny, the more I think about affinity spaces, and I also want to throw in here the cohort model as being like an important model where that provides opportunity for peer support. But of course, both of those things have to be held within a larger supportive structural context. But it just calls to mind the recommendation around more collaboration between institutions. Are we having conversations with our partnering credentialing programs? Because one of the issues that came up is, do teachers have affinity space opportunities, spaces throughout their credentialing career, credentialing progress? So not just at the school site, but also in their credentialing programs. And then I think it raises this interesting challenge, because in order to create safe affinity spaces, you have to really develop affinity capacity, which is what you're raising. And that really highlights places where there isn't as much diversity as there should be. So I feel like it's a cyclical process that also can impel different bodies to really relook at their own staffing and their own capacity for providing those spaces.
I also think about the role that site principals play. If this is something that they're holding up as a priority, how are they creating space throughout their planning of the year? What kind of goals are they setting for their school site every year around building and sustaining a pipeline of educators of color at their school site? And then in developing those goals, recognizing that affinity spaces is one of those, how can they facilitate leadership by offering an opportunity for a teacher or several teachers to lead in this way, and giving them resources to do it, not just tapping them as leaders and saying, hey, I want you to create an affinity group, but how can they allocate resources so those folks can meet on a regular basis and share out some of their key learnings and continue and push, and the leader facilitating a type of arrangement or relationship where they can push and say, hey, these are some of the things that we need to sustain ourselves at this school site and as educators more broadly. But if site leaders are saying this is something that they want to do, then they have to make space for it and have to allocate resources for it to happen.
We have a member of our participant today who would like to ask a question orally. Guthrie, please. You do have to unmute though. We can hear you now.
You can hear me? Okay, sorry, I'm having some Wi-Fi issues here at the school. So kind of the flip side of that question about, peer-to-peer support and administrators, site leaders creating those spaces or making those spaces available. Did you have any findings or recommendations with regard to how site leaders and or districts can, I don't know if the word is buffer or protect or support teachers of color from daily microaggressions and or all the way up to, overt acts of bigotry from other teachers and colleagues within the building?
What comes to mind is one of the pieces of recommendation was around something mentioned by Dr. McGowan Robinson around doing racial bias and trauma work. We recognize what you're addressing is really like a culture shift at the site level that takes a lot of individual introspection and group collective support to carry out that work and manifest those values at the site level. So there was a recommendation that the CDE might provide professional development or training to counties about anti-bias training, anti-racist practices, and what those look like. We haven't, I would say, haven't touched as much on what that transformation looks like at the site level, aside from hopefully those trainings being able to have an impact on site culture. Curious about what others on the group think.
Yeah, I would just say we didn't really, there was not a lot of discussion about the sort of protection piece of it, or I mean, that's that idea of buffering. That I don't feel like that was much of our conversation. And I think it is a lot of the struggle between how do you support folks right now and the sort of the short-term immediate need for change, as well as this the cultural transformation that Suchian talked about, right? And I think we did focus groups additionally with teachers of color. They talked a lot about the need for training, not just implicit bias, but really sort of cultural proficiency training, and making it not opt-in, right? Making it mandatory for all educators on a site. And so building the capacity at all levels, recognizing there's going to be resistance from some. But yeah, we didn't really talk about the need, the specific need of supporting administrators to protect and advocate for teachers of color in challenging situations right now.
One thing that comes up for me in those conversations was the recognition of needing additional support from community organizations. And one organization that came up was the National Equity Project, and hearing from some leaders about how they have used organizations like that have a very clear racial equity lens to come in and do professional development for leaders and for educators. And I think while that's just one example, it is essential that leaders have the lens to recognize that there needs to be protection in place, and then how to address it when it comes up on site. And so that extension beyond the anti-bias, the anti-racism work extends not only to educators, but to site leaders and to district leaders more broadly.
And I would just maybe quickly add, as someone who is actively preparing school building leaders in our principal leadership program here at Berkeley, it will be important for me, and there's time in the syllabus, to help white leaders, for example, understand that when it's lunchtime and the one or two Latinx teachers are not in the lunchroom, but they're sitting in their rooms, to give that white leader a lens to maybe consider that there's something about the interpersonal relationships that are present at the school that they need to be attentive to, that they may need to create some conditions where all teachers are maybe coming together. And so I think that I am very much aware in my own work that yes, there's work for people who are maybe principals who are currently practicing, but there are clear implications for those of us who are preparing principals to help them be aware around when teachers of color are isolating themselves or are isolated. And that's because of the racial dynamics between the adults in the building.
Add one more thing, and I think that it sort of emerged in this idea of being really intentional in articulating this priority in our plans. I think there's a real opportunity at the site level and at the district level to name creating culturally affirming anti-racist schools as a priority, right? So, and I think as much as administrators at the school site and the district level name that, write it down, talk about it, and talk about what investments it's going to take to do that, the clearer it becomes for all stakeholders or all community members there that this is a priority for the school. And so that begins to foster conversations and identify where there are gaps and where there are needs.
This portion of the conversation really takes me back to something that Dr. Bristol started with in his talk about how we have to measure progress. And so when, for instance, as Sarah suggests, that we aspire to having a more anti-racist school or climate, whether it's for the students or the teachers or the families or everyone, what are the kinds of indicators that from your work you think would be appropriate for a site or district leader to begin to use to inform themselves. Some of them have been, I think a lot of what's been raised so far is about informing our interpretations or our analysis of specific dynamics. But how can we also use it to monitor progress or change over time? I didn't promise you that I would give easy questions. Sorry.
Please, Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, as I think about just the work we do in the equity space, and like one thing we do before we even go in and do a workshop is to do a needs assessment. Just going in, talking to teachers, having focus groups, having one-on-one conversations about how are you defining equity as a school site? Do you have a common definition for that? What does racial equity look like? How are you defining that here at your school site? What is your vision for equity in your building? And then coming to agreement on common language, because we throw a lot of terms around in the education space, but we might not be coming to it with the same definition. So really having clarity about what does this look like for our school site and where are we going? And then from there, you can develop a plan and develop benchmarks based on that plan, and recognizing that this is not something that's going to happen in 9 months. But this is a dedicated effort over years. And what is your commitment as a school site leader, as a school community? How are you collaborating on this? And then how are you measuring this year over year? What positions do you need to put in place? And all of that is formed by that needs assessment and your goal setting along the way. Those are just a few tools that I would share.
And I wanted to add that also at the district level, districts don't tend to, I think Dr. Bristol kind of alluded to it and talked about that, there is some data that we could be collecting. If we have teachers leaving, where's your data on, who these teachers are that have changed professions or changed districts? Do you have any data that actually supports that, or just say, bye, see you later? What are you actually looking at? Do you even have any idea of why that particular teacher left? And have you looked at it in terms of the lens of this was a person of color or not? Or do you just say, well, we lost 50 teachers last year? There should be more than that. There should be more data collecting. No, not necessarily that it goes out to everyone, but districts should have that information. And I don't know that they do. I don't know that all districts even collect it. But I think it's important information. It's something that they should be able to track and then turn around with the equity liaisons that they have hired and the diversity specialists that they've hired. Why is this happening? Is it a particular site? Is it a particular area of our district? Is it because we are rural and we don't have a population? What is the problem? And start actually addressing it and not just saying, well, we have a department, we have an equity department, and check that box. But what is actually happening in that department to build on that recruitment and the retention, the keeping of why are they not here any longer? Why did that teacher leave or those teachers leave and run to a different district, especially if it's in your same area? That's kind of scary. Why would that be happening?
And I'll just add at the state, oh, sorry, Travis, go ahead. At the state level, I think we've been having conversations around, we do have a requirement for school climate surveys, right? Our schools are conducting surveys of our students and our staff and our communities, but there's not what happens with that data, how it's used varies across the state. And so, and it's not elevated as we look at school performance at the state level. We have a school, California school dashboard where it just says, did you conduct the survey or didn't you, essentially? And so we've been really talking about how can we ensure there's consistent data that looks at the experience of students and community members and the staff, that districts know what to do with it, and districts are using it in a way that's actually informing and improving the climate there. The state did put some money in the budget to look at this question last year, so we're excited that there is beginning to be a bit more of a focus at the state level on it.
I was just going to add similar to what Shelley said and similar to what Sarah who's doing incredible work, GLASP and OUSD. And this is the point that I mentioned in the presentation, is that that there are states like the state of Delaware, right, which every year they disaggregate by race the percentage of teachers who are turning over. And we don't do this here in the state of California. And so it will absolutely, and I believe that there is will to do this at the state. And I think that this group are charged with providing some recommendations that will be one of them, to disaggregate by race turnover rates by school and by district. So that, I think, could be one indicator that I hope to show up on a dashboard next year.
I also wanted to highlight what Sarah Glassband, the Director of Recruitment and Retention in our district, what she put into the chat. We have the quantitative piece, which is the annual retention data about who returns year after year. And then the more qualitative piece, the annual retention survey, which gets a sense of the overall push and pull factors that are happening for teachers in our district. And then I also feel like it's important to highlight as more districts work more intimately with aspiring educators through programs like the Classified to Teacher pathway or the After School to Teacher pathway, and you really get to know all the factors that individuals are contending with, it really gives you an insight into a deeper type of data. For example, that you might have like a 5-year funded program for teacher credentialing, but sometimes it takes much longer than 5 years if you are supporting children and you're taking care of elderly parents at home, and you're also contending with the pandemic. And so just understanding that there's actually like a whole other story that's not being told through data that should inform how long funding lasts and how long program support should be in place.
So because 21 CSLA is a project of professional learning for teachers, sites, leaders, and district leaders, I want to end with a question about professional learning for developing the capacity of leaders that will do the opposite of what Dr. Bristol found in his study, which is teachers not leaving their students, but leaving their leaders. How do we provide professional learning that will prevent that sort of thing from happening in the future, but instead encourage more teacher diversity and ethno-racial diversity and linguistic diversity, all kinds of diversity in our schools? What kind of professional learning is needed for site leaders and for district leaders, in addition to what's been named already, or feel free to emphasize or to add? I can hardly believe that. I think this is a competition of
Laura, I'm so eager to. I'm curious what you think, given your work.
I was trying to step up to step back because I answered first the last time, but I will absolutely jump in. I'm thinking about just the idea of critical self-reflection. I'm thinking about Muhammad Khalifa's work on culturally responsive school leadership. I really think that school leaders, district leaders need a frame. And I so admire the work of Dr. Khalifa in thinking about kind of the gifts and talents that exist in the communities that we serve, and tapping into those gifts and talents, and seeing diversity as an asset and not as a deficit. So really, what kind of frame are we coming to this work with as leaders? Are we coming to this work with an anti-racism lens? Are we engaging in critical self-reflection to identify those areas within us that we have not dealt with that may be contributing to these disproportionate outcomes for children of color? And through that frame, how are we developing professional learning communities within our districts that are with an equity lens? How are we supporting those that we lead ourselves and those that we lead to get the professional development that they need with that so speaks to that equity lens? How are we bringing in community partners? And I'm not just talking about community partners to provide professional development, but I'm talking about community partners that can directly speak to the experience of our students. I'm talking about the barbershop owner. I'm talking about the woman who has a nail salon in the community. I'm talking about the local council person. What examples are we holding up for both our educators in our building and for our students? So I'm thinking about that, a framework that our leaders so need in order to do this work. I think that there's a lot of things coming at our leaders right now, and to be able to ground themselves in something that really would speak to all of the different challenges that they're experiencing is what we need right now. And so I am a large proponent of culturally responsive school leadership. And so I would encourage our leaders, if you haven't heard of Muhammad Khalifa's work, to pick it up and see what practices you might be able to adopt from his work.
I feel like I'm taking up more than my share of airtime, but I just want to surface data. It's important to go back to the data and see, district-wide where the teachers of color are, where they are teaching, and also where are the teachers who are not yet credentialed or who are under credentialed, where are they teaching, where is the turnover happening, what are some of the factors what are some of the patterns and trends that we see across the district in terms of teacher turnover and lack of retention. And then there are different departments within central office that can support with this work, Office of Equity, to kind of not only look at the data collectively, but support, identify and drill down at the school site level. What are some of the push-pull factors happening there? And not using the data in any kind of shaming way, but more of like a self-reflective way, as Laura just mentioned, just having a chance to look at it collectively and then analyze what might be happening so we can come up with collective solutions.
I'm just going to throw into the chat this recent piece that I wrote, co-authored with Amy Scallon and Joy, who's a doctoral student here, that looks at why the principal practices, right, or leadership practices that teachers identify as their reasons for staying or leaving. And so I think that this kind of work could be included in some professional learning community for leaders to support teachers. And if folks don't have access to it, just send me an email and I can send you the full article.
Shelley, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just quickly going to add, just on the site leadership and also district, that, our funding source in California, LCAP, and the permission to look at some of our funds and being able to say that we are targeting diversity and equity. I think a lot of times when people are working on their LCAP plans, they don't always, I'm not going to say that everyone does, that not everyone does, but I know that there are school districts where they don't. They're focused on, the reading and the writing. They're focused on the actual tangible things that they think that they have to. And then, well, we have about $5,000 here. We can maybe put that towards equity, as opposed to putting that at the top of their list. As been said before, let's make that a priority and then work through everything, and just everything from that lens. And I think that we just have to be able to give permission to ourselves to be able to do that, and to say that that's okay and that is fine, because we are still educating our children. It doesn't have to be pigeonholed into, this subject and that subject in this area. And I just wanted to kind of mention our funding source, because I think sometimes people feel strapped by it, and especially in our districts, they feel, oh, that we have to follow just like this. And if we're not doing this, then we're not doing enough.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bristol for a few closing comments.
So thank you, Rebecca. And I can't thank Laura, Sufyan, Shelley, and Sarah enough for all of their work. there are about, I think, 12 or 13 folks on this advisory group, but they were the ones who really took the lead on synthesizing all that we had learned and began drafting out this internal report for the department. Let me just take a step back here. I started out by saying that that this is one not about resources, but about will. And I actually believe that there is this policy moment here in the state of California in which there is great will to do this work. We have a Democratic governor, a legislature that is very strongly Democratic. We have a state superintendent whose charge to me was be bold, be ambitious, identify folks who can thought partner with you to give us some critically important strategies. We have Mary Nicely, who is now the Deputy Superintendent of Instruction, who's really embedded herself in our conversations, who comes. And we have a state board president, Linda Darling-Hammond, whose work is embedded, whose work aligns to the work that we are pushing forward that is further sort of testimony to this policy moment that we're in across the state. And so we have the resources with ARPA funds. We have the will, given what I've said. Now it's about getting the work done. And I believe that some of the points that you heard here will be taken up by the department because there are both resources and there is will. And so what I ask and invite you all to do is, if there are pieces that you heard that you think that might be missing, reach out to us. Maybe Moonhawk, you can drop our contact information. You should feel free to contact anyone here. Because our goal is to do this work, not only for Black, Latinx, and Asian American children, because given what the data say, but white children on the peninsula, white children who live in the Oakland Hills, they also need to have teachers who look like me, because we live in a flat and interconnected world. And so this is an invitation to continue to thought partner with us in service of the children across our state. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, to my colleague and friend, Rebecca. Thank
you so much. In the presentation, we have provided a resource slide with some links from the California Department of Education, Dr. Bristol's work, and also some work at the leadership programs at UC Berkeley, where we have engaged in documenting some of our efforts to diversify the leader workforce. We also want to encourage you to give us some feedback about this webinar. We want to produce webinars that are connecting research and practice, real issues of practice that can be informed by research. And so we appreciate your input. I believe that the link is being placed in the chat. Finally, we want to also highlight that we have another research project going on inside 21 CSLA, which is very much connected to today's topic. It is about investigating issues of principal resilience. We have a survey where we are surveying California principals about their working conditions, specifically with a focus on the conditions that support them and support their resilience, and the conditions that erode their resilience. We're seeking a large sample of principals from around the state so that we can really inform policymakers about the perspective of principals during this time period. So we also encourage you, we've put the flyer in the chat and also in the slide deck, and we encourage everyone to help us to gather the voices of principals so that we can continue to amplify the needs of leaders. Thank you so much again to our panelists, as well as to Professor Bristol. I want to also thank everyone who took time out of an incredibly busy time in education to be with us today. Thank you for working with our children and in our communities. We appreciate all of your efforts and your time today. Good evening.